one. When you write, do you ever talk aloud to yourself, or is it all words?
It's all, well, I mean, once in a while, if I can't get a line straight, I repeat it a bunch of times so that I can demonstrate that a mouth such as mine could actually say this out loud. But generally, I really experience writing as listening, and so there's a kind of sense of being the kind of scribe for this long talking person that that I work for, kind of.
For you, the process of writing poetry and the process of writing fiction, can you talk a little bit about that? And do you have to be in sort of a different mind state to go and do it? Or?
I feel like they're different jobs, like literally. I mean, I feel like there's something, I hate to put the burden of realism on novels and writing fiction, but I think there is some way in which there's a social thing going on, and you actually want to describe kind of a reality that's composed of many pieces, as opposed to, poetry can be something very simple and quick. And also, I think there's a way in which the body, like that thing I said earlier about, I think when you write a poem, there's a way in which you cannot escape the body. To my mind, there's a coordination of eye and hand and everything that this moment is that makes me make exactly those choices on the page. And I don't leave the room. I kind of write the poem in the room, I think. Whether the room comes in literally or not, it's part of the abstraction. Whereas I think, for me, my experience of writing fiction or reading it, is that I actually leave my body, and I leave the room. And I think that's the desire, And some people talk about the history of the novel being about, the middle class and the creation of the bourgeoisie. And I think there's even a joke about, one of the assumptions you make about writing a novel is that I'll be able to buy a house. To write the next novel in, or there's an exchange of some, there's and I think there is a sense that a novel is a real person, a real writer, and I certainly, I make jokes about it in this book, but when I was first beginning as a young poet, I had a stepbrother who was a guy in advertising who was a novelist, and my family had such respect for him, because he writes books, real books, and it was like, I would have these like slim poetry books, and it was like, So but I do think, and truly, it's like when I was in college, I wrote both. And I think and I had more desire to be a novelist because I wanted to be real, and I wanted to be a person of some gravity, and yet I kept being attracted to poetry. And then I discovered, and basically my experience as a younger person was that poetry suited my attention span, and that I could realize a poem. Once I had a sense of what a poem's measure was and how it felt, I could know when a poem was done, and even a bit when a poem was good. But to have that kind of sense of things with a novel seemed like, my God, how would you know? And I remember the first time I wrote, when I'm describing being in Pennsylvania, writing this book, I was writing my first collection of stories. And luckily this house had an incredibly long table. And I just remember the experience, and this is the moment of the dedicated word processor, not yet the computer, like in the 90s. And I remember having all the chapters of the book all over that long table, and like literally walking around the table and moving the pieces and stuff. And I had to do that because as a poet, one of the things I knew about writing a poem is that I could have it on 2 pages, I could have it in my mind, I could memorize it, and that I just didn't know what to do with the expansiveness of this larger form, And also, just personally in life, I felt like when I got into my 30s, I started to be able to write longer spurts, and it started to be about how I was living. And I think, obviously people come to different things at different times in their life, but for me, it's sort of like the novel grew out of the poem, like really literally. And it's fun, and now it's, to shuttle back and forth, like poems seem to be about the kind of the very variations in existence. It's like every time something changes, it gets a poem. I feel like there's something very seasonal about poems to me. And it's sort of tracking this kind of thing. I read once in a medical journal that manic depressives go craziest in fall and winter because in a given day, the temperature changes so many times that people who are triggered, just go right out of there, And I think poetry in a way is a form of that, like just charting something, and you're playing your music, kind of, metabolically.
Hey, adding on to the last question, why do you think novelists and playwrights sort of have the support and respect and poets seem to be treated differently? And also, will poets ever reclaim this respect? And is it possible to be commercially viable, and if that even matters?
I mean, I think this, you know, like it costs, you know, you buy a book. You know, people, it's sort of like a social custom. You know, I mean, like I think certainly the way it's evolved now. You know, you go to the airport, there's no books of poetry in there unless it's like by Jewel, or you know, it's sort of like anybody but a poet's book of poetry might be there. You know, and likewise, what did you do last time? I went to the theater. You know, it's like I went to New York, we saw some plays. You know, it's like people don't go, we went to New York, we do a poetry reading. I was like, really? How weird. So I think there's a society around those art forms and a kind of a credentializing that they're kind of, they're sort of handsome and sort of fun. People know what they are, really. And I think part of it truly is just historical. You know, that poetry as a medium, you know, became displaced by rock and roll and recording and media and all that. But I think that, I think poetry is really getting discovered right now by the art world. It's kind of like poetry, you know, like a poem. You know, and I've gone to, you know, shows at various galleries where young artists, and so like people keep trying to colonize new things, and it's like, you can colonize a poem, you know, and one show where I heard this show was described, I didn't even see it, but it was sort of like they had a bunch of vitrines around the room, and it was just like moments. You would walk around the room and either read the poem under glass or pick up the page, and it was this kind of sensational thing. And you know, Julia Child making movies about poets, and Howell. You know, I think the poet is, being rediscovered as a figure, and I think part of it is that in the same way that theater was getting reinvented in the 70s because people were so overwhelmed by the media that the avant-garde started. You know, like Richard Foreman, you know his work, and it was just like it was so about film that suddenly avant-garde artists wanted theater that was like this, you know, and Robert Wilson, and just working with the medium of time itself and saying, no, fuck you, we're going to slow it down incredibly, you know. And I think there's a radicalism, and I think poetry is I think right now is really perched beautifully to be in that position of radicalism, and the poet be a newly discovered character, you know. I mean, too, you know, in the poetry world too, there's a thing. There always, since I first came around, I was told that, you know, if you want to be serious, you gotta write a long poem. You know, like that's what, you know, like the prelude, or you know, like something. And I was never interested in writing a long poem, nor did I think. Well, actually, it's a lie. I wrote a long poem, I just never published it. But it wasn't. It just didn't. I was sort of unwilling. But I think of the novel is that form too, that I think the novel could be an epic poem in a poet's hands, and that's what this is my long poem, essentially. I also think when poetry presses start to record their books, I think there'll be more public acceptance, because I think a lot of people would love to drive and listen to poetry, and we're not really giving them, you know, it's sort of like the sense is the CD, you know, like we were talking about spoken word before, you know, earlier, and I think the assumption was that only spoken word poets would want to do CDs. And I think the quiet poets would also be like really great for long drives, you know?
I have a pretty bad memory, so forgive me if I misquote you a little bit, but I think in the beginning you were saying that Cool for You was in some ways about women or women in institutions, mm-hmm. and sort of that kind of either wanting to get out or feeling sort of trapped in it. I think you said something about there was also that narrator sort of seemed like a woman as an insider, mm-hmm.
And that men at the time were kind of concerned with being outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about why, you know, sort of that insider-outsider dynamic, and what you think made women more as insiders at that time, or was it just that particular character, you know, the narrator?
Well, I think women, I mean, just sort of like historically, I think we get kind of filed in under domesticity and quieter and the internal, you know, and all that. And I think there is kind of that. And also invisibility. which often, either you don't see the person or she's there, but she's just doing something. She's, like the despised figure of the mother, right? I mean, it's sort of like, I'm really been very interested in this lately. It's sort of like, certainly as I'm 60, I'm older. And lots of my credit being taken, when Cool For You came out, I got a review in the Times, and it said, she's a cult figure to a generation of post-punk females and stuff. And most recently that got quoted, and I was like, she's a mother to a generation of post-punk. I was like, what? And I thought, is that more honorific? But also I thought it was erasing my coolness. Like I wasn't, how could I be cool at 60, And it was sort of like, it was, so I think there's a lot of funny things that happen in the history of but I think that the female is often not seen, as a figure. It's sort of like, and certainly we know that, like lots of movies that aren't starring women, like women, we know that women are here, we're here, but somehow it's sort of like couldn't hold a movie down, and I was like, really? Because it's sort of a life to the side kind of and stuff. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that specifically because I thought a lot of, and also I have my grandmother, my father's mother was in a mental hospital from age 60 until her death. And that's how I knew, having a grandmother, we would go to the mental hospital and visit her. And that's what I thought was normal, and yet nobody ever talked about it. I was like, how did she get in there? What was the story? We just thought it would be a nice place to bring her at some point, And nobody in my family could tell me that story. So as all these things were happening at once, like I read, Elaine Showalter has a book called, I don't forget what it's called, but it's about the relationship, women in relationship to the history of mental illness and the institution of psychology and mental hospitals and stuff. And I read that, and it was it was all happening at the same time I was starting this book. And I really had this haunted feeling about my grandmother, and so I petitioned the state of Massachusetts to get her records. It was so interesting because I no longer lived in the state of Massachusetts, so I had to have my brother sign for me. It was like, I thought, this is weird, is it, that I'm not allowed to have my grandmother's records, my brother can't, get them. And as I was, actually after I had finished the first draft of the novel, the records came, and I suddenly learned more about my grandmother than I had in the 45 years of being in my family. Massachusetts had all the information, and it was incredible. So it's sort of like there was that feeling of that woman inside, but I thought, indeed, I've been inside of schools and families and camp, I've been a camp counselor, and it was just like, and going crazy from there, not going crazy outside of there, going crazy inside of there. And I just thought that's the avant-garde narrative of my female.
And correspondingly, I wonder if you could explain what you mean by the obsession of the male with the male outsider. What was that?
The obsession with the...
Well, you were talking about the female insider, so the male outsider.
Well, I think the avant-garde, it was a way of, I think there was a way of men positioning themselves as like outside. If institutions are bad and we're criticizing them, one thing we'll do is say, we're not in them. We're like, that whole notion of just being the outsider. Interestingly, what's her name? Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a really great book called The Hearts of Men. And I feel like it's the most interesting book about, it's not I guess it's a work of feminism, but basically what she looked at was every social movement that was about liberation, whether it was the Beat movement, the Hugh Hefner kind of cool guy movement, or the hippie movement. It always meant men leaving the family. It always, part of the freeing of each one of these, it was sort of like, it was so weird, like where the right wing is always saying, these women have left the family, and the kids have no, and I'm blaming it on the women, and feminism, what the hell, but the guys left. It's sort of like part of the way of being a free man. It was like, what's his name? Dean Moriarty, had a wife and kid and was driving across America in a shitty car, with Jack Kerouac. It was like, wait a second, who left? So I think that there's so much kind of like excitement about that kind of outsiderness of the man. And I think often women who are, taking on the mantle of the artist want to be outsiders too. I'm outside too, but somehow it doesn't have the same panache, I think, I mean, I guess that's another debate, but I do think it's sort of like one of the, I mean, like I was someplace recently and somebody, I think it was an essentialist question. It was sort of like, well, I mean, like that I was talking to young female writers, and they were asking me, you know, your work seems to be like so deliberately about being female, you know, like is that, you know, isn't that, you know, and they didn't say, isn't that sort of essentialist? But I do think that no matter how masculine I feel, I am still filed under female. You know, unless I have a sex change, I'm female here, and that will be my destiny in a certain way. I will have a female life, you know, and so yet I think that like many women who are artists, I, you know, wanted to live like the guys and write like the guys and do like the guys, and at a certain point, it's sort of like when you're wearing somebody else's clothes, you're like, wait a second, this doesn't fit. You know, these clothes do not fit my body. This looks funny, this feels funny. And to try and figure out that you know, like what do you do with that point? Like put on a dress, you know, or figure out the mixture that is mine, you know, and I think exploring the spaces of inside and outside have been part of what I've been interested in, talking about masculinity inside of being a female, you know, to not abandon my femaleness, but to rather think about how it's an inside-outside job.
You came to New York during a very specific time, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what the young poet's experience would be like in New York today in terms of a trajectory and a career, and how that's changed since you came to work as a poet in the Southeast.
Well, I think you know, economics has been are you know, like such a huge shaping force, and I think it's sort of pushed young poets into graduate programs pretty intensely, and so again, I think it's a different kind of inside experience for a lot of people, and I think that sort of like you kind of you get prepared for the art world by these institutions, whether it's the Whitney program or you know Columbia's MFA program or the New School, and so people often come to New York to be in a program, which I mean honestly I did too, but I just didn't. I mean, I didn't stay in the program because New York was so much more interesting than the program, you know, and that there was such a kind of a bountiful excess at that time, and there was more public arts funding, and there were more cheaper. I mean, you know, the thing that people my age endlessly talk about, yeah, it was a day, you know, and stuff. On the other hand, the money was spread out in this wide way. There wasn't such a. That one of the things that's so interesting about what it might be, what I see, you know, whether it's students or friends being a young artist in New York now, there's such a cachet to being young, and you know it, you know, and I think we didn't exactly know it. It was just like, it was just kind of great and cool to be in. There were older people and younger people, and it was kind of fun to be a cool younger person and have an older person talk to you and stuff. But I think there's a sense that you know, there's a market now for young, is sort of like part of what people are going to graduate schools for are to sell that manuscript, you know, to make your mark, you know, like, and I think that I think there was a kind of a sense that we thought that the road we were on would invariably take us to that place. So you didn't worry about, you know, like getting in there kind of. It was sort of like you kind of came to, you know, like literally the language, people who were older than me would say this, but I remember at some point people saying, so Eileen, when did you come on the scene? And they meant, it sounds like such kind of like, but it was kind of as if we were standing on a film shoot, you know, and it was our life, and you were like, whoa, I didn't notice you used to be like, you know, one of those extras, and now you're like standing right there with the main characters, and how did that happen, you know, and stuff, and there was just a sense of, you know, like people, it seemed like the work was time, like you just came to hang out, you know, or that's what it seemed like to me, where I think it's much more focused and engaged, you know, and obviously, I mean, people who come up now came up through a whole different culture than the culture I came in. I was prepared to be kind of a slacker and hang out and make my mark that way, whereas somebody, you know, who comes to New York to go to Columbia had to get in, had to figure out how to write those poems, and so it's a whole different, you know, you weren't just suddenly on that road, you were always on that road, you know, so I guess it's a different world. I think one of the things that's tricky right now is the conversation between these generations. Both, you know, like I think about that in terms of being female, but I also think about that in terms of economies. You know, we get cheap apartments, you get big book deals, you know, and what does that, what kind of respect then gets exchanged, you know, or, you know, what do you do with experience, you know? It's sort of like, is it just something that I barter in a writing program? You know, like I can get paid to teach young people to, you know, so it's very curious what the world, how all these things have been shaped. But I think the hardest part is how to have that conversation across those, you know, because people are sort of staying in their sectors in a way, I think. You know, sort of like, you know, not to make it you, but you be the student, I be the teacher, you know, and this, I have resentments, but I'm not going to talk about them because I'll lose authority. You know, but everybody knows. It's like the academy. Everybody knows that women do all the work in the academy, but since the academy is a feminist institution, who wants to say it? You know, you can't even say it out loud because that would make everybody feel so bad about how the institution doesn't fail, doesn't succeed in its own mission. You know.